Good afternoon. Welcome to Douglas County Chamber's virtual State of the Economy Luncheon sponsored by Kaiser Permanente. I'm Gil Strauss with the Douglas County Water and Sewer Authority and your new 2021 Chamber Board Chair. Now, please enjoy this video from Kaiser Permanente. Thank you to Kaiser Permanente for that important information and for your sponsorship of today's luncheon. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker. Dr. Joey Smith is an economics professor and the chair of Department of Economics at the University of West Georgia. Dr. Smith earned his PhD in economics from Georgia State University. His primary areas of expertise are program participation, state and local taxation, and urban and regional economics, specifically focusing in the West Georgia region. Dr. Smith is well known as one of the leading regional economic forecasters, and we are pleased to have him with us today.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to start off by thanking Douglas County, the Douglas County Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to speak today. I have to say it's not that often that economists get an invitation to pretty much anything. So as Yoda would say, life of the party, economists are not. So I hope to be able to change that image a little bit by starting off with an overview of the local economy, which probably doesn't change the image even a little bit. But I hope this helps in understanding what's going on both locally and regionally. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the labor market. We're going to cover things like unemployment claims and unemployment rates. We're going to look at a few key industries that are central to our local economy. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the effect that COVID has had on our local economy. And we're going to finish up with housing before wrapping it all up. So to start off with, we usually talk about initial unemployment insurance claims, and these are the claims that people make as they are transitioning from a job into unemployment. This is the first step that happens right after somebody loses their job, and as such, this is considered to be one of the better leading economic indicators for the region. And one of the things that you should be able to see here, I'm going to point it out, this is the Great Recession, okay? It started at the last part of 2007 and went all the way through the middle of 2009. And you can see what unemployment insurance claims look like during the Great Recession. I'm going to be careful to point this out for you. This is the COVID-19 recession. You might not be able to spot that peak, but it's quite a bit larger than what we experienced during the Great Recession. And first of all, I want to say we don't really have a cool name for the recession that we're in right now. But at some point, we're probably going to see that the bar that we've set with this new recession, we're hoping that we never duplicate, match, or even come close to approaching this anytime soon again. And so when it comes to this recession, you know, we're talking about numbers that are much higher than what we experienced in 2007 through 2009. Given that the peak in 2020, it occurred in about April. And one of the things I will say is that the peak is probably artificially high. There were a lot of people who file for claims that may not actually have been eligible for claims. And so there's been documentation of that at the state level. But even when you take that into consideration, this recession, at least for the time period that we see early in the process in early 2020, was much worse than the recession that we experienced during the Great Recession. Another thing I want to point out here is that when you look at the peak of the Great Recession, we've just now gotten to the point where we're below, in the current recession, we're below where the peak was during the Great Recession. And so that's a positive note, but still it's something to consider, that we've gone effectively the entire year of 2020, and only recently have we dipped below in terms of new unemployment insurance claims, dipped below where we were at the peak of the Great Recession. When we talk about unemployment, unemployment rates really jumped up significantly during the first month or two of the COVID lockdown. Obviously, when we went from having unemployment rates of the 2.5% to 3% range across the region all the way up to 12, 13% in some of the counties locally, that was a huge shock to the system. The unemployment rates have fallen back down to more reasonable levels. In fact, right now we're dealing with a regional unemployment rate that's around 5%, which is, in the grand scheme of things, 5% is in that range of what we consider full employment. The problem is right now that there are several thousand West Georgians who are sitting out the pandemic. They're sitting on the sidelines and they're waiting for something else to happen. They're waiting for either access to the vaccines that are available. They're waiting for a safer job to appear. They're waiting for access to childcare. This is actually a growing problem, is that there's a lot of people who don't have access to childcare. They are not, all the children are not currently back in schools across the region. And so this creates a childcare situation for a lot of families. And in that sense, a lot of those folks have had to stay home in order to take care of their own children, because their kids either not back in childcare, or they're not back in school yet, or not back physically in school. And some may simply be waiting on the sidelines for additional unemployment benefits to kick in. But that really, they've been setting out for a long time if that's the reason that they're waiting. Another thing is, some of these folks may have decided to take this particular moment to go ahead and retire. And so we may have lost some of our more experienced workers to retirement because they just did not want to risk going to work during the middle of a pandemic. Whatever they're waiting on, there's still people who are waiting on the sidelines. And so there's lots of reasons. We just don't know exactly what each individual reason might be. When we look at the unemployment rates by county, what we can see is that Douglas County is actually topping the region, and is above Georgia as a whole and above the Atlanta metropolitan area as a whole in terms of unemployment. Right now, Douglas County is significantly above the rest of the region. It's sitting just above 6%. And although 6% is bad by comparison, really you're still talking about pretty close to that range that you would expect during a reasonably good economy. And so we've, even though we've had a really large uptick in the unemployment rates regionally and county by county, the recovery from those highest unemployment rates that we experienced back during the spring of 2020 have actually they've improved quite a bit. That's not to say that we're out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination, but we are doing significantly better than at the same period of time away from the beginning of the recession during the Great Recession. So if you look at this graph, one of the things I want to point out is that the blue in this graph is the West Georgia labor force, and the red is the unemployment rates. And typically, we want to see these moving in opposite directions. We want to see the blue rising and the red either falling or flat. As the blue rises, we're seeing an increase in the size of our labor force. This indicates a growing economy. This is a big positive for the region when we see people moving into the region and we see growth in the number of people who are trying to find jobs in the region. And typically, the unemployment rate, we would like to see either falling or flat at the bottom because, there is a lower bound to what an unemployment rate could be. But as of November, December of 2019 and January and February 2020, we were right around that 2.5% to 3.5% range for the entire region. And that's actually below what we would consider full employment. That's a really very good, positive number for an unemployment rate. But it does mean that there's a lot of people who are probably employed at that period of time that might not otherwise be employable. They might have very few job skills. People are just looking for essentially a warm body to put into a position, and they have a job. And so once the pandemic started, a lot of workers were laid off, they were furloughed, they decided to stay home for a variety of reasons, whatever that was. But what happened is after they left, they stayed out for a pretty considerable amount of time. You can see that blue line, it kind of meanders up and down once you pass February of 2020. And it's only recently for West Georgia that we've seen that start to head back in the upward direction for more than about a month at a time. But this still is a reasonably positive thing, especially when you combine the fact that that is occurring in addition to the unemployment rate falling significantly over that time. And so really, if you start about August of 2020 and move forward in both of those time series graphs, you see that they start moving apart from each other again. Unemployment rates start to fall and the labor force starts to rise again. And so we're getting back toward a pretty positive place in the economy. If you look at Douglas County specifically, the same thing is occurring. Douglas County has had about 2 or 3 good solid months of increases in their labor force and declines in the unemployment rate. The last month was a little bit of an uptick, but it's still trending in the downward direction, trending back down to where it was prior to the start of the recession. One of the things I will point out that's a big positive for Douglas County is that Douglas County now has a labor force that exceeds the size of the labor force at its peak before the start of the recession, before COVID became a problem in West Georgia. However, between the peak and the trough, Douglas County lost about 5,000 jobs from its 5,000 employees from its labor force, and added almost 10 points to its unemployment rate. And so that's a shock to the system. There's no way around that. That's a big shock to the system. And some questions that creep into the process is, are the people who are returning to work the same people that left jobs at the beginning of the pandemic? Are we getting people that are now younger, maybe less vulnerable workers, but who potentially have fewer job skills? And so the question really is, could this have an impact on productivity? And so what I would say is that Douglas County right now, in terms of the unemployment rate and labor force, is doing better than other West Georgia counties, doing better in terms of its movement out of the recession, even though its unemployment rate still remains relatively high. Despite basically fully reopening the economy, however, Douglas County unemployment rate is still about 4 points above where it was before COVID struck. And this is not unusual. Other counties in the region, they're still about 2 to 4 points above where they were before COVID. And so it's not unreasonable for Douglas County to be in this same situation. The one thing also I would want to point out is that even though labor force numbers are back up, they have not grown significantly above where they were at the beginning of the recession. And so really where we are is about just a tiny bit above level. And so we really haven't started that process of growing again, both in Douglas County or for the rest of the West Georgia region. So you can see here, this just points out in more detail, Douglas County has regained virtually all of its lost labor force and maybe has added a smidge. That's a technical term in economics, a smidge. But not everybody has found a job that was laid off that lived in Douglas County. Okay, so when we look at unemployment rates, those are based on the place that you live. And when we look at these labor force numbers, they are also based on the place that you live. And so we haven't quite regained all the jobs that we've lost. And that's the reason the unemployment rate still remains relatively high in the county. And so you see here, I've pointed out Douglas specifically. Having negative numbers in this is not unusual. As you can see, virtually every cell has a negative number. I pointed out the only positive is that Polk County in our region added government jobs. It added 0.23%. Virtually, I shouldn't say virtually, every other cell in total, in goods production, in the service production, and in government all had negative numbers in it. Douglas County did have significantly negative numbers on the total number of jobs that were lost. Douglas County remains about 11.7% below where it was prior to the start of the recession. Now, keep in mind, this is the change from 2019 quarter two to 2020 quarter two. So the most recent industrial employment data that we have is only through about the summer of 2020. And so this is really giving you the worst of what's happened. And so if you think about where these numbers, what these numbers tell you, it's more giving you the autopsy of the recession, not so much where we are at this very moment. But one of the things I do want to point out, this gives you an idea of what the scale of this recession was. In about 6 months, West Georgia lost about 16,000 jobs in 6 months. That's a 9.3% decline in employment across our region. And so there's no way to paint that as a great picture. That is a tremendous job loss. One of the things I also want to point out is that Douglas County's larger losses came from the service sector. You can see that 14.76 is the share of jobs, so 14.76% decline in service jobs, and service jobs makes up about 2/3 of employment. 2/3 of every 2/3 of the total employment in Douglas County comes from the service sector. So that's a pretty big hit, and it's not significantly higher than everybody else, but it is higher. So that's something that Douglas County does have to worry about, and some of those jobs came from areas that are really important, like retail and the restaurant industry. Construction employment has remained relatively high. Uh, the construction employment levels are pretty much the same as they were prior to the recession. Wages have dipped a little bit, but not significantly. And primarily this is because commercial, single family, and multifamily development still remains pretty strong. The demand for those kinds of developments are still outpacing supply. And so construction jobs are still doing fairly well. Manufacturing jobs are not doing very well. Even though this graph only goes through Q1 2020, the most recent numbers indicate that jobs have not declined a little, they've declined a lot. Manufacturing jobs are down about 20.8%. But manufacturing jobs were already heading downward before the start of the pandemic. And so this is really a continuation and an exacerbation of the problems that were already starting to creep in. A lot of this is related to the trade wars that we have been experiencing over the last couple of years. It's, we're starting to see some of the negative effects of our products not being competitive overseas because of tariffs that we've imposed on other countries and those retaliatory tariffs that have come back onto us. We have heard a lot of positive news that's associated with a car manufacturing and car sales. However, that was relatively short-lived. After the middle of last year, we saw a really sharp recovery, a sharp increase in the number of sales starting about the middle of 2020, but that's started to turn negative again. The sales growth ended really in 2017, and we've been traveling down that downward slope for the last 3 years. And this is just really a continuation. And the reason this is an important area to talk about is because regionally, we have about 6,000 jobs that are tied either directly or indirectly to the automotive sector. And so we're talking about a relatively large component of our industrial base. And you see that V-shaped gap. I don't know exactly where to point on the screen here, but if you see that V-shaped gap that occurred during that sort of manila color, that's the point at which the recession started. That's the COVID decline that we saw in automotive sales. It jumped back up pretty quickly. But one of the things to keep in mind is that even though it jumped up, that V didn't get filled in. We didn't compensate after the fact and fill in with sales the loss of sales that occurred during that time period. And so those are just lost. We are not regaining those. And so the recovery was brief, and we're continuing in that downward direction now. It's already started to trickle, started to flow away from us. And part of that is coming from what are traditionally pretty good sales brands. Honda, Hyundai, Kia, these are all brands that are important in our region because we've got Honda Lock and Honda Precision Transmission in Haralson County. We've got Kia that's just outside of our region in LaGrange or just south of LaGrange. And we've got Hyundai, which is a partner with Kia, and it's just outside of our area, but over in Alabama. All of these are important manufacturers locally because they employ people in our area. And you can see that in 2020, we've already had some pretty significant declines in sales. And they haven't even provided all of 2020 sales figures yet. So we don't know what the full year looks like yet, but it looks like it's going to be significant and negative. Total service employment has been heading in the upward direction for quite a while. And in fact, we've been replacing a lot of the jobs that were going into manufacturing with service jobs. And so there's been a transition between manufacturing and services that's been going on since probably the late 1980s that's about the time frame that it's occurred. Right now, the service sector accounts for about 2/3 of the jobs in our region. And average pay had been going up. It had been going significantly up, especially when we're talking about, the pay that's associated with what typically could be considered lower skilled jobs. One of the things I want to point out, though, is that not all service jobs are low skilled retail jobs. Services also contains jobs that are in the healthcare industry, and those are typically higher paid and higher skilled. And so when we're talking about these service jobs, they've been going up in pay because some of those jobs are healthcare jobs that we're transitioning to. And so, that's been a big positive for our area. Retail employment has been flat for a couple of years now. And in fact, it's been going down more recently, and it's went significantly negative during the recession. And part of this right here is the transition from brick and mortar to online sales. And there's been a lot of ink and a lot of discussion that's been dedicated to that. But right now, retail is down about 5.2% as of the middle of last year. And once we see the entire year, it's going to be even further down. It's probably going to be down at least twice that. And so retail is really an important sector, not because it pays a lot, but because it employs younger workers, lower skilled workers, seasonal workers, and it may employ people who are getting their first job. And so these folks, this is a lifeline for them. This is a way that they can get employment, and it might be their first job. And so retail typically is a really important part of the job base, but retail has been doing considerably badly during the recession, especially when you're talking about things like clothing retail. Groceries have been doing pretty good, pretty well. General stores like Walmart, Sam's Wholesale, Target, those have been doing okay, but that's primarily because they've been considered essential services during the pandemic. Clothing stores weren't, and clothing stores were decimated. I mean, they were really hit hard. In some places, they've closed down. Sales have dropped 70, 80% for a variety of reasons. One reason is they weren't considered essential services. Another reason is if you're not having to go into work every day, you don't require a wardrobe and new purchases on a regular basis. Unlike economists, we buy our wardrobe when we first become economists and then never, ever buy another suit and tie again. That's pretty much it. So you better hope you don't gain any weight over that time frame. These parts of retail have been really hard hit during the pandemic. It's going to take a while for these areas to recover. Healthcare employment. This has been the star service sector, and it continues to be the star, even though it hit some pretty significant snags early in the process. One of the things everybody thinks is that during a COVID-induced recession, obviously healthcare is going to continue growing because we need those healthcare jobs. But the fact of the matter is healthcare didn't continue growing because a lot of healthcare is tied to office visits and to elective procedures. And those were essentially shut down for about 2 or 3 months, and continue to be a little slower at recovering because people are afraid to go into a hospital for fear of running into a COVID patient. And so, there's some issues that are still being sorted out in terms of trying to get healthcare back on track. But when we're talking about job losses in healthcare, they are likely to be relatively short-lived. It's not that they're going to be permanent. These are going to be short-lived because people are going to come back into the healthcare system. We live in a state that has a relatively, I don't want to use a term that's going to offend anybody here, but we're a more experienced state. We've got a relatively more aged population. We eat a lot of fried foods. I'm one of those, and we're not the healthiest group on the planet. And so, oftentimes we may end up using healthcare more frequently than we might hope to. Now, when we talk about healthcare, this brings us into COVID. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is that we're right now in the midst of our third wave of COVID. And I'm not an epidemiologist, but one of the things that I do read all the time is graphs. And what this seems to indicate is that every time we see the start of the wave, we see that peak, which is represented by these vertical blue lines that I've put into the graph. And then soon after the peak, we see the peak in death rates. And one of the things that is a serious concern right here is that we are seeing, we are reaching those peaks, and each peak that we reach is a higher and higher peak. Now, hospitals have been expanding their capacities, their abilities to take care of more COVID patients as time goes on, but there is a limit to that. There's a physical limitation on space and on resources. And beyond that, quality of care starts to suffer and the death rate starts to increase. And so one of the things that we have to be careful at the county level and at the state level is not to push it to a point where we're exceeding these limits that are the hard limits that we might face. And, you hear about people complaining that we don't want to ration medical care. Well, we're already doing that. We ration medical care, and when people come in, triage requires that we deal with the patients that we think we can get the most benefit from treating first. And so that's going to happen more and more frequently, and it's going to be because we've essentially overwhelmed our hospital system. And there's parts of the state that don't have as good access as we do. We're in an area where every county in our region has a hospital in it, and we have several counties that have regional medical centers. And so we're actually pretty well equipped from the hospital standpoint, but there are other parts of the state that are not equipped at all. So when you look at the state, I want to point out that red is the point where you see more COVID cases. Actually, this is my only joke. Everywhere in the state is showing higher COVID cases than we were. If you look, darker red means a larger share of the population is COVID positive, not necessarily more cases total, but more cases as a percent of the population. And what we see here is that in the area north of us, there is a band of high density COVID cases. And we're kind of in a pocket where COVID cases are, it's not that there are few of them, it's that they're just less dense. But we're close to a lot of areas that are fairly dense in terms of COVID cases. And so, if you look on the west side of the state, in Cedartown all the way to Dalton, there's a darker red region, and above Atlanta and Gwinnett County and some of the counties that are north along Highway 400, there's some pretty big hot spots that are occurring in our state, and those could easily come in our direction. We're not in any way, shape, or form protected from this. And so growth in new cases should be expected. There's not a lot of ways that we can say this in a form that isn't scary. So I just wanted to point that out. But there's some parts of the economy that are dealing with this pretty well. When we look at housing, people in the housing sector have been stepping up and using online resources. And what we've seen is that permits are rising and sales are rising, and the price that we're getting for our houses are also increasing. Sales price is up 13.2% from last year, which is a significant increase. And this is even considering COVID. Mortgage rates are at historic lows. 2.77% is the current 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So if you're looking to sell a house, it's time to do it. 50.7 days is the number of days that it typically spends on the market before you have a signed contract. That's down from 56 days last year and 67 days the year before. And so one of the things I want to point out is if you think you want to sell a house, you better have another one ready to go, because you could be living in a van down by the river if you don't. One of the problems that we're facing, and this is the last thing, I'll close it out with this right here. One of the problems that we're facing is the potential for a new wave of foreclosures because of the forbearances, and also a potential rental crisis as well because of eviction protection. And so we really don't know how this is going to resolve itself, because this is not just an economic issue, it's a political issue as well. And so there are reasonable fears that this pandemic could trigger a new wave of foreclosures, but that hasn't started yet. But one thing that we do know is that mortgage delinquencies have been up over the past year, and they spiked around the middle point of last year above where they were in 2010, which was an especially bad year during the Great Recession. And so that's, I've got a list of concerns, but I see that I'm already several minutes past what I was allotted. And so I want to open it up and address any questions that might be out there.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Joe. And we do have a few questions. If I can ask those of you, we've gotten some through our social media channels. So just a few questions here from our listening audience. The first on the, let me get to the right question. Sorry. Back on the unemployment numbers, somebody asked if the unemployment rate takes into consideration the quality of a job, or asked a different way, does it consider those who may be underemployed? So while they may be employed, they may not be at that same level they were before the pandemic.
That's a great point to make. They do not. When you're looking at the unemployment rate, it only takes into account whether somebody is actively working and receiving a paycheck. And so if you've got somebody who has a college degree but is effectively only working 20 hours a week as a Domino's delivery person, that person is considered to be employed, not unemployed and not underemployed, because that's a different measurement altogether and a more difficult measure to make. But what I would say is that there is probably a significant proportion of the economy of our workforce that are in jobs right now that are not best suited to their skill set. And there may also be people who are working at jobs that may be beyond their skill set because people are afraid to try to churn those people around and find better fits for the current jobs that they have. And so that's part of that productivity question that I have, or I had in one of the slides, is that if we've lost some of those older, more experienced, but yet more vulnerable workers to either retirement or to a fear of coming back into the workplace, this is going to have an impact on the workplace productivity, and it's going to have an impact on your ability to find employment that suits your skills. So good question.
Great, thank you. So the last few questions all kind of relate to the same thing, forward looking. So I'll caution you, remember, we are recording this, so everything you say will be
held against me in a court of public opinion.
That's right. So several questions we have relative to what do you think is going to happen in the future, whether it's about retail here in Douglasville. We have a regional mall. There's also some questions about what do you think may happen relative to the elections and the change in administration. So just maybe speak to your thoughts on the future for a little bit, if you could.
Okay, so let's start with the probably the low-hanging fruit, the easy thing first. In terms of the mall, we have seen a gradual transition over the last actually probably more like the last decade. We've seen a gradual transition from brick and mortar stores to more online sales. One of the things that happened that sped that up has been the pandemic. The pandemic has motivated a lot of retailers that were thinking about going online, that were already dabbling in some online space, to go ahead and go big with this. Kroger is in the process of developing something called Kroger Marketplace, which they claim will eventually compete with Amazon. Head to head, you're going to have the ability to buy essentially all of your groceries and all of your every good that you can think of in a Kroger Marketplace as opposed to the Amazon Marketplace. And so they're going to be competing directly. Walmart Plus and Walmart.com is already doing something similar to that. Now, these are big businesses, but you have the ability as a small business to utilize the Amazon Marketplace, potentially the new Kroger Marketplace. You can use these as a platform to sell your goods, to sell your services online already. And so the question is, how much and how willing are local retailers to transition into those spaces, and how much of a hit is it going to inflict on them when they do? Because it's not free for people to make this transition. It's not they're going to lose some of their revenue to Amazon, to Kroger, to other businesses. Even Walmart is doing stuff like this, and so that's going to have an impact. I would venture a guess about the mall is it's going to have to transition its use in some way, because clothing stores and retail is changing. And when you're talking about a large brick and mortar mall, those kinds of developments and those kinds of activities are not part, or they don't seem to be part of the growing landscape of retail that's out there. The growth area seems to be more online. Now, the mall could become some sort of fulfillment center, or it could become one of these places like Kohl's department store currently takes returns from Amazon. And so you could see some of these creative reuses. It could even become part of a completely different use. There are folks trying to find spaces for people to meet in a classroom environment. And so, I don't want to put this out there, just as an offhanded statement, but malls are big indoor spaces, and there's a lot of things that you can do with big indoor spaces. So creative reuse is the way that a community can help and determine how that mall actually ends up being used. And so, active involvement with the owners. And I know right now there's, I think that the owners of the mall of Arbor Place are in bankruptcy. Is that correct?
I wouldn't be able to speak to that. Yeah. I'm not going to be able to speak to that.
At the very least, there have been owners of malls that are in Georgia that have entered into bankruptcy and are going through the process of reorganizing to try to figure out a way to continue forward. And so that's probably going to be on a lot of minds of retailers. How do we address this whole online sales issue? Now, the one good thing for Georgia, we didn't talk anything about state revenues or any of the issues that are happening politically in the state. But one of the things I will say is that we made an excellent decision a few years ago to try to incorporate some of those online sales into our sales tax base. And so if you buy anything on eBay, if you buy anything on Amazon, the sales tax is automatically calculated as part of that. It goes into the Georgia coffers. And so there's no inequities when it comes to the kinds of retail that happen online and the kinds of retail that happen in brick and mortar, which was a big problem. That created a massive inequity between online retailers and brick and mortar retailers, and that online retailers could effectively sell at a lower price, although you were evading a mandatory tax that virtually nobody paid. The use tax, you did not pay. Most people didn't pay the use tax when they bought their laptop online because nobody came looking for it. Technically speaking, you were supposed to fill out a form and remit that to the Department of Revenue for the state of Georgia, but I personally don't know anybody that did that. That's not to say nobody bought a laptop. I just don't know anybody that remitted. And I'm not going to implicate anybody here. So if you bought a laptop in prior years and didn't pay your use tax on it, I'm not going to tell on you. But I would encourage you to go back and amend that. When it comes to politics, I want to remind you that I'm an economist, and we are notoriously bad at politics. But what I will say is that there have been a few decisions as the new administration has come in that I think is really positive. First and foremost, they've picked really competent people to manage our economy. Picking Janet Yellen to run the U.S. Treasury, I think, is a good thing, a very good thing. There's this guy George Akerlof that said that she was a good pick. George Akerlof is a Nobel Prize winning economist, and also her husband. He said she's a better economist than he is. So I consider that a really good reference. And she also did a pretty good job with the Federal Reserve Bank when she was there. So we've got people in place that I think are good at understanding the issues that are related to the economy. And so that's one of the reasons that I think that we haven't seen, a massive sell-off or any kind of market turmoil as the transition occurred. It was because good people were picked to occupy those positions. I hope that continues. So in terms of other political issues, I'm not really the best person to ask about that. I'm not a politician. I'm not a political science person. But I will say that turmoil leads to a bad economy. And the main thing that we need to do is to get COVID under control. We've kind of let the cat out of the bag when it comes to trying to cut down the prevalence of COVID spread. And so really we've put all of our efforts into developing a vaccine, and the hope is that not only will the vaccine be as effective as they say it is, but it will be taken by as many people as possible, because that's the way you stem the spread. And so, my main encouragement would be, as soon as you get access to the vaccine, take it. I plan to do it myself. You might not be able to tell, but I'm just a little bit too young to be able to go get it as a 65-year-old. And I probably have plenty of pre-existing conditions, but I don't want to jump ahead of anybody. I don't want to claim anything that would put me in a position of getting it over somebody who actually needs it more than I do. So I'm waiting my turn, but as soon as my turn comes, I'm going to take it.
Well, great. Thank you, Dr. Joey. We don't have any other questions that have come in now, so I think we'll close that. I really want to thank you, Dr. Joey, for your time today, for the information, for fielding the questions like you did, and for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Anytime. Economists are always willing to talk to anybody at any point. So call on me anytime. I appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Thank you again. And as a thank you for speaking today, we do make a contribution in your name to the Chamber Board Scholarship, and that scholarship funds a scholarship for a graduating high school senior each year. Now, to close out, we have just a few chamber announcements for us today. First, the 2020 Community Awards will be presented at the Community Leadership Luncheon on February 17th. This is going to be an in-person event. We'll have it at the Douglasville Conference Center at noon. So please come out and support our well-deserving community members. And secondly, our Leadership Douglas applications are now available. Those are due on March 12th. This leadership program is designed to educate its participants about the Douglas County community while learning leadership skills and connecting with other leaders in our area. Don't miss out, and please sign up now. Thanks again to Dr. Joey for joining us today, and a special thanks to Kaiser Permanente for sponsoring today's luncheon. Have a great rest of your day.